Oh yes, thank you. You mentioned this, Bob. If you don't know me, I'm Colleen Parsons, and I teach in the English department here, and I run the Global Irish Studies program. And September is a really difficult time to get people to pay attention to you. And so I'm delighted that we even have an audience. It's been a busy day and a busy week in Georgetown, so you're all very welcome. We're missing students here, but sure, whatever. We'll wait. I'm sure some people will filter in. But this is our first on-campus event. It's our second event of the year. Global Irish Studies is our first on-campus event, and we're delighted to host Bob Volpicelli. I'll just say, for those of you who have no lives, next week at 11 a.m., a really interesting speaker, Dr. Patricia O'Lynn, who used to be a member of the Northern Irish Assembly and is now a sort of a consultant on education policy in Northern Ireland, will be speaking about her work on education and reconciliation. So basically very closely related to Bob's talk today. And we have more coming up over the course of the semester. Obviously, you're all on our mailing list, so watch out for that. I won't keep you because we want to hear Bob. I'll just tell you a little bit about Bob, and then we can launch into the presentation. We do have access copies here. If anybody needs access copies, just let me know and I can bring it around to you. Bob is an associate professor of English at a neighboring academy, which is Randolph-Macon College, just outside Richmond, Virginia. So thanks, Bob, for taking the train up today and for the train not being cancelled or late or.
It was pretty late to be here.
Okay, all right. Thanks for taking the early train today. We appreciate that. Bob's first book, Transatlantic Modernism and the US Lecture Tour on sort of modernists and their engagement with a particular kind of politics of fame at the turn of the last century, won the Modernist Studies Association First Book Prize. That is a real vote of confidence in Bob's work from his colleagues in the field. And his writing on modern literature has appeared in 20th-Century Literature, New Hibernia Review, Novel, PMLA, and Modernism Modernity, which is to say all of the major outlets in the field of modernist studies and in literary studies in general. I think you're going to tell us a little bit about your next book project, and so I won't go into that, but I just want to give a very warm welcome to Bob, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about James Joyce's Bad Visions. I did say that as I was about to send out the emails a couple of weeks ago, I nearly titled it James Joyce's Bad Vision. Which would have been a complete screw up. All right, Bob. Thanks very much for coming.
All right, thank you everyone for being here, braving the weather. I really appreciate it. I'm here today to talk about James Joyce's incredibly bad eyesight and some of the artistic implications I believe it holds for his work. I'm going to start though by talking about the larger project from which this Joyce material comes. I'm currently writing a book about the relationship between modern art and literature and visual impairment. And I'll mention right away that the project as a whole is quite international in its scope. So if we want to talk more about that in the discussion later, we can. And then after some initial description of the book, I'll turn to our main focus for today, which is how Joyce represents visual impairment in his writing, and how other artists then later have figured this aspect of his authorship in their own portraits of Joyce and in their own artwork. So quite a few visuals that I'll do my best to describe as we go. So I'm going to start by putting on the screen now a 1937 portrait of Joyce, a silver gelatin print in which Joyce is wearing incredibly thick glasses, you'll have noticed right away. That left lens in particular made even more apparent to me because of the angle from which the photograph is taken. This is an interesting series by a portrait artist named Breitbach. What can be more common than a portrait of the author wearing glasses? In this context, glasses convey not only the focus of the author, but also the particular strain that belongs to the labor of writing. Of course, this labor also evokes certain class connotations, which is why the right eyewear, I've always thought, rounded perhaps, thick certainly, carries with it the social distinction that sometimes has been attached to the profession of the author. Aside from these specifically literary associations, though, eyeglasses are a prosthesis so familiar, so ordinary, that they can hardly seem worth noticing. Thus, philosophers have used glasses as an example of how everyday life passes into an invisible presence for us. Ludwig Wittgenstein offers corrective lenses as a metaphor for those human laws of culture and language that we simply take for granted. Quote, like a pair of glasses on our nose through which we see whatever we look at, it never occurs to us to take them off. Speaking even more directly to this experience, Martin Heidegger writes, quote, when a man wears a pair of spectacles which are so close to him physically that they are sitting on his nose, they are environmentally more remote from him than the picture on the opposite wall. Their proximity is normally so weakly perceived as to go unnoticed, end quote. Here, the weakly perceived presence of glasses points to the remoteness, I think, of perception itself, the way our modes of vision become habitual and therefore imperceptible as we move through the world. Yet philosophical observations along these lines only account for those visions that are working smoothly, that after some minor correction once again function well enough to be overlooked. Bad visions, I argue in my book project, are much more noticeable. They evade easy redress or modification. They draw attention to their imperfections and impairments. Defying the social mandate that the operations of our bodies remain invisible, these modes of seeing generate the kinds of disruptions typically associated with disability. As disability theorists have shown, such disturbances are what grants disability the power to defamiliarize the human body, which is to say, to take it out of its usual context in such a way that allows us to scrutinize our own embodiment. And so my current book project claims that visual impairment, in the many different forms that it takes, is able to make our vision newly perceivable to us. By obscuring those things we aim to see, visual impairment brings awareness to the larger field of vision, highlighting both what is seen and what is unseen. Or to put this another way, inspired by the image here on the screen, the glare on an especially thick pair of glasses refracts our attention from looking through those glasses to looking at them, lending a sort of thickness to the very act of perception. In my current work, I attend then to instances of glare, blur, and haze in an effort to show how visual impairment shape the perspectives embedded in works of modern art and literature. In the existing scholarship, discussions of visual impairment and aesthetics tend only to focus on blindness. And to be sure, this criticism has performed the vital work of complicating our perspective on blindness by positioning it outside a simple sight, lack of sight binary. Yet these conversations have also left unexplored, I think, the wide array of conditions that exist between the severe impairments we signal with a term like blindness and full sight. My project, therefore, situates itself within this in-between space by exploring how these other bad visions, including relatively mundane conditions like near and far-sightedness, trigger the experimental forms we have come to associate with modern art and literature, forms like abstraction, fragmentation, and rejection of verisimilitude more broadly. Additionally, my work contends that the artists and writers who embraced bad vision did so to contest the idea that there's only one proper or correct way of seeing the world. So as a whole, my book focuses on how such bad visions refract through the writing of different modernist artists and authors. I'm writing one chapter, for example, on the aesthetic of opacity that would seem to define the prose and poetry of an American author named Judah Barnes, and another on the forms of socially obstructed vision encountered in the work of Ralph Ellison. However, I also give much space in the project to the visual arts, and an essay I just published on Claude Monet's late painting serves as a useful introduction to the kinds of analyses that I pursue across the work as a whole. And so that essay is called Monet's Cataracts Reexamined. In the first decade of the 20th century, Claude Monet's world started to blur. The painter began to experience the onset of cataracts, which is a clouding of the eye's internal lens that can cause both haziness and color distortion. Hoping to avoid an operation, Monet started taking eye drops for his condition around 1912. However, about a decade after that, he finally relented and agreed to surgery. He in fact had 3 surgeries within a 6-month period, with his recovery from the second of these requiring that he remain in the dark, not us though, immobilized by sandbags, incredibly, for several days. These surgeries, along with a pair of special cataract glasses, ultimately did provide Monet with somewhat clearer vision. Nevertheless, he spent his final years struggling to paint through what he described as a thickening fog. Now, personally, I think the paintings that Monet completed during this period, where he's experiencing his cataracts in the most severe ways before the surgery, surgeries that he had are absolutely incredible. And we're fortunate that Monet repeatedly painted the same scenes throughout his lifetime, so that we can compare more or less the same subject matter from early on in his career to this later period. So I'm going to begin by showing you a painting that perhaps you've already seen or might be familiar with. This is the 1899 version of Monet's Japanese Bridge, which is iconic Impressionism in its focus on the natural scene. You have a surplus of cool colors like greens and blues surrounding the bridge here. And the hastiness, the classic Impressionist hastiness of the brush strokes, attempting to capture, which again is in that iconic Impressionist style, a fleeting moment, a record of time, which is always emphasized in Impressionism too, through its attention to light, right? So this is a painting that maybe we would associate with turn of the century Impressionism in general. But let me hasten to move on to a painting that I find incredibly interesting, which is a later version of the Japanese Bridge, done in 1922, the annus mirabilis of modernism, no less, during the high point, you might say, of Monet's experience of his cataracts, so right before the surgeries that he began having there. And here, this bridge is utterly transformed. The colors, those cool blues and greens, have been exchanged for an intensity of reds and oranges and purples. And I think even more interestingly, the blurriness of the brushstrokes here, the exaggerated hastiness that we saw in that earlier painting, challenges what we think of as representational art. It takes a while to even realize that this is a bridge being represented here. And so the painting, the later painting, almost approaches what we might call abstraction in that sense, right? And so the essay I've written about the late Monet is a kind of reception history of these so-called cataract paintings that I used to put the argument of my book project into focus. The first part of this history is that early on, art critics, really without any reference to Monet's paintings, saw this as a bridge, for lack of a better word in the moment, to modern art of the 1920s, right? They saw Monet turning towards abstraction and thus replicating the aesthetics or matching the aesthetics of painters like Picasso, Matisse, who were doing kind of more aggressively experimental style during this period. And so that was how these paintings were understood for many years. And then I discovered that there exists another reception history of these paintings, where for 4 decades or so, they've been studied by eye doctors. And in ophthalmological journals, and the focus there is on diagnosing Monet and figuring out what type of specific cataracts that he had. And they do things like use computers to measure the extent of the blur between the early and later paintings. They do DNA tests on Monet's relatives to try to find out if there was a genetic disease that Monet perhaps had that led to a specific type of cataract. So it's a very scientific way that they're looking at the paintings, and their conclusion is that they reached the strong diagnostic position that this isn't modern art at all. It's eye disease, right? That Monet painted this way simply because of his eye disease. And with that, then I turn to the argument of my book, which is that these cataract paintings can be both, to me, modern art and eye disease together. And that an artist like Monet, I think, becomes the most modern version of himself when he incorporates his embodied and impaired point of view directly into his artistic vision. So a kind of synthesis there of the two reception histories of these paintings. So I'd be happy to talk more about Monet's impaired impressionism and the discussion that follows. But for now, I'd like to transition from visual art to the ways in which bad vision can appear in literature. In particular, I want to take up some of my recent work on James Joyce, who holds a central place in my new project, for Joyce had notoriously bad vision. He was extremely farsighted, we know from an early age. He suffered from bouts of a painful eye inflammation related to iritis and glaucoma. And he had some 14 eye operations during his lifetime, and this at a time before modern anesthetics. So they would rub cocaine on Joyce's eyes to numb them before the operations. And as these episodes frequently interrupted Joyce's writing, the author's eye condition hasn't gone unnoticed among his critics. In fact, I should point out here that with Joyce scholarship being as meticulous as it is, there already exists a brand of criticism that seeks to pin down all the details about Joyce's eye problems. I've just been rereading Kevin Birmingham's The Most Dangerous Book, perhaps you know, it's a biography of Joyce's novel Ulysses, where Birmingham gives very graphic descriptions of Joyce's eye issues and surgeries, and one chapter pins them all on Joyce's having contracted syphilis at one point. And so there's his diagnosis of Joyce. There was an article in the James Joyce Quarterly not too long ago that is an entire article on James Joyce's prescription for corrective lenses, and how we've been reading Joyce's vision all wrong because he was actually farsighted rather than nearsighted. So Joyce critics have gone down this rabbit hole before. But for me, the particular way they're approaching it is analogous to the kind of diagnostic readings that ophthalmologists were undertaking with Monet's paintings, right? Which is reductive in the sense that the focus is on the artist or author's body and diagnosing the physical condition there, and not on the artistic or aesthetic possibilities of their work, which for me does not have to correspond with exactly the condition that they had, of course, right? There can be quite a bit of distance there. So I'm much more interested then in considering how Joyce deploys visual disability as an aesthetic resource in his writing. And to provide some examples of this, I'm going to turn to Joyce's 1916, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, his novel, where the author specifically calls upon bad eyesight in that book to carve out a space, an artistic space, opposite the many pressures of development and personal development in that book, how the main character, Stephen, should be developing. So we'll call this next section James Joyce's Broken Spectacles. Bad eyesight is crucial to Joyce's artist from the start. Indeed, in the very first pages of Portrait of the Artist, they announce the looming threat of imperiled vision with Dante's teasing admonishment of young Stephen with a kind of nursery rhyme threat: pull out his eyes, apologize, apologize, pull out his eyes. In addition to providing the novel with some of its mythical overtones, this portent of impaired eyesight carries over into the next scenes to highlight Stephen's own awareness of his, quote, weak and watery eyes on the playground. The wateriness of Stephen's vision implies a kind of synesthetic experience that in turn emphasizes the intensity of his childhood sensorium, where all sensations for the youngest version of Stephen we get in the book are potential sources of aesthetic pleasure. And low vision, Stephen's low vision, is not seen as an impairment so much as a conduit into this very vibrant world, the vibrant physical world around him. In the book, we get a rather direct look into such a world in a later episode that you maybe remember, when Stephen is unable in this particular scene to participate in his writing lesson because he's not wearing his glasses. They had actually broken the day prior when he was pushed down on the cinder path outside of school. And so I'll read this passage, I'll put it on the screen, and I'll just say that in all of Joyce, this might be one of the most important passages to me in an essay that I published a few years ago. It helps me formalize in that work what I call modernist low vision. And so I pay a lot of attention to this short paragraph here. For reasons I think you'll notice in a second. So here's Stephen in his writing lesson without his glasses. During the writing lesson, he sat with his arms folded, listening to the slow scraping of the pens. He had tried to spell out the headline for himself, though he knew already what it was, for it was the last of the book. Zeal without prudence is like a ship adrift. But the lines of the letters were like fine invisible threads, and it was only by closing his right eye tight, and staring out of his left eye that he could make out the full curves of the capital. Here, Stephen's blurry vision enacts what we can call an unfocalized narrative, to adapt Gerard Genet's term. Through his impaired eyesight, Stephen introduces a disability optic that makes available new aesthetic experiences through the defamiliarization of normative bodily functions. Put differently, low vision effectively causes Stephen to lose sight of the task at hand, which is his writing lesson, and I think sets his imagination productively adrift, to use the language of the passage. The object of his attention shifts then from the prudent rules of his writing lesson to a zealously pursued aesthetics of sensory experience. Stephen hones in here, for example, on the slow scraping of the other students' pens and on the appearance of the fine invisible curves and full curves of written letters. That vision thus inspires its own, and I think, parallel form of close reading by making the experience of reading in this moment opaque, causing the observer to scrutinize what is typically perceived as a relatively smooth and transparent process, the production of meaning through signs for reading. Joyce's passage proceeds to illustrate how this non-instrumental view of reading and writing facilitates a new attention to the aesthetic or artistic aspects of language, an attention conveyed in this passage with both repetition, tight, and alliteration, curves of the capital. It's through the blurry lens of low vision, then, that Stephen Douglas first unlocks his potential as a poet. And there's a lot more to say about this scene and how Stephen's bad vision in the book is disrupting his potential Bildungsroman, or novel of development, coming-of-age story, in the way it's kind of pushing off the normative sense of development. You'll remember that at this point in the novel, the prefect of studies walks in, and because Stephen's not doing his work, he calls Stephen a lazy, idle little schemer. Such a phrase suggests that Stephen is at the very least unproductive, and perhaps also codes him in the novel as sexually deviant. And here we might probe some of the moral valences of blindness through, say, the Oedipus myth, or the longstanding cultural association between blindness and masturbation. Yet, regardless of the specific connotations of the phrase, I think it's pretty clear that the label serves to place Stephen outside of the arc of normative personal development. My main point here being that the modernism of Joyce's portrait truly emerges when he forgoes the development of the Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age narrative, to embrace the disability aesthetics of bad vision. Later, when faced with the decision of either joining the priesthood or pursuing his art, an adolescent Stephen catches a glimpse of his classmates as they swim. As Stephen endeavors to work out the details of this image from a distance, I think in this passage, I'll put this up on the screen now, we see Joyce's own version of an impaired impressionism. And there are authors who are described as impressionistic. Joyce is not usually one of them, but I think in these passages from Portrait, a style or sense of impressionism really comes through. And you might catch it initially as I read through this one, and all of its attention to light, as we were just discussing a while ago with Monet. So here's again Stephen looking from a distance at his friends as they swim. He recognized their collective speech before he distinguished their faces. The mere sight of that medley of wet nakedness chilled him to the bone. Their bodies, corpse white, or suffused with a pallid golden light, or rawly tanned by the suns, gleamed with the wet of the sea. Their diving stone, poised on its root supports and rocking under their plunges, and the rough-hewn stones of the sloping breakwater over which they scrambled in their horseplay gleamed with cold, wet luster. In this scene, low vision makes Stephen's decision for him. It detaches his attention from the orderly procession of robed priests witnessed just prior to this moment, and submerges him instead in an unorderly world of sensory reflection. Crucially, it's not just the sight of these bodies that pulls Stephen back toward the world of aesthetics, it's the near sight of them, the faint perception of pallid golden light that emphasizes Stephen's embodied condition as well as his limited physical capabilities. Even with his glasses on, then, Stephen's spectacle is still broken. Filtered through imperfect eyesight, this scrambled series of impressions quickly jumps from one sensation to the next, only ever composing a weak narrative of drifting perceptions, one that all but halts the forward motion of Stephen's potential Bildungsroman. Both Gregory Castle and Jed Esty have pointed to a similar kind of arrested progress in reading Portrait as an example of the modernist anti-development plot. Where these critics mostly see Stephen's stasis as a product of the uneven developments of empire, I would argue that the narrative disruptions in Portrait owe at least equally to the embodied experiences of low vision in that book. This modernist low vision, as I've been calling it, inflects Joyce's other writings too. In the Circe episode of Ulysses, Stephen suggests that he either broke his glasses again or perhaps remembers breaking them 16 years ago. It's not entirely clear. It's one of the many small details that Joyce critics argue over. Of course, they do. Of course, blindness is also tapping around the edges of that novel in the character of the blind stripling, and in Stephen's own experiments with self-imposed blindness in the Proteus episode, where he closes his eyes and walks along the shore. But instead of pursuing such moments at present, I would like to use the rest of my time to shift back to visual culture and discuss how several portraits of Joyce portrays bad eyesight. I do so because collectively these portraits convey something of the overall significance of visual impairment to Joyce's version of the artist as I was just describing it. But just as importantly, I also find that turning to other artists' perspectives on Joyce offers one way of diversifying the field of Joyce studies at what is perhaps an important moment for doing so. So in what follows, I'll be especially eager to highlight the work of female photographers who have taken portraits of Joyce, like Giselle Freund and Berenice Abbott. So this last section then is called Portraits of the Artist as Visually Impaired. So I'll put up on the screen first Freund's portrait, which maybe you've seen before from the cover of Time magazine in 1939, which features an image of Joyce there reading again through his thick glasses with the aid this time also of a magnifying glass. And I'm going to describe this image a little bit more in these next couple paragraphs. James Joyce is the subject of many portraits. Highly conscious of his own image, Joyce wrote works of semi-autobiographical fiction that can be read as exercises in self-portraiture. And it's perhaps for this reason that so many other artists have felt the urge to produce portraits of Joyce. Scholars have been interested for some time in the proliferation of Joyce's image and influence within art and other visual culture. In one of the most sustained analyses of this kind, Maurizio Biscagli and Edna Duffy look closely at Freund's photographs of Joyce for the author's 1939 profile in Time. With exacting precision, these critics read into the smallest details of Joyce's face, the dry, stretched skin, the line of the mouth and thinning hair. It's not a very kind portrait. And discover there are certain tensions, tensions between Joyce's Irishness and cosmopolitanism, and between his individuality and self-commoditization that characterize Joyce's identity as an author, as well as his struggle later in his career with international literary celebrity. And yet, rather surprisingly, these critics and others spend very little time reflecting on what is, for me, a singular detail that defines so many portraits of the author, his impaired vision. In Freund's photograph, like the one that appears before us here, this detail is literally glaring, with light reflecting not only off of Joyce's glasses, almost obscuring his left eye entirely, but also off the magnifying glass he uses to read. The profile inside the magazine further emphasizes Joyce's bad vision. Quote, Joyce's curious glasses give him a somewhat Martian appearance. The left lens is so thick it is almost a hemisphere. The full paragraph goes on to detail Joyce's many operations, presenting vision issues as one of the chief concerns of his literary career. In their reading, Biscobli and Duffy note that Joyce's squinting in the portrait on the cover here can be understood metaphorically, in straining to see Joyce gestures perhaps of the problematic nature of the gaze at play in media images like magazine covers. Seems like a Joycean thing to do. But this observation hardly exhausts, I think, all the layers here, as the squint also reflects back onto the author as a sign of the incredibly fine level of detail for which Joyce's work had already become known by this point. Moreover, the entire scene suggests another major tension involved at the center for me of Joyce's authorship. So on the one hand, the portrait of the visually impaired author cements Joyce's place in a literary canon by inviting comparison to other authors like Homer and Milton, who had visual impairments as well. And on the other hand, the image suggests how bad vision also jeopardized Joyce's status as an author, as the papers he struggles to read in this particular image are in fact page proofs for Finnegan's Wake, the writing of which was regularly put on pause because of his eye attacks and surgeries. So this tension, bad vision as both an enabling and disabling attribute of the author, becomes a mainstay of portraits of Joyce over the course of his career. The development of this trademark feature, of course, has to do with the way Joyce's vision worsened during the last 2 decades of his life. It also has to do with how this authorial image crystallized into its mature form over time. Accordingly, early images present a much different visage than the one that we meet on the cover of Time. Consider, for instance, and here I'll put on the screen another photograph fairly well known of Joyce from 1904, taken by Joyce's friend Constance P. Curran, in which Joyce wears a derby cap and a dark suit and stands in front of a greenhouse. Someone at some point later on asked Joyce what he was thinking about when his photograph was taken in this image, and he replied that he was thinking, but he's wondering if Curran would loan him $5 or £5. Indeed, he did. So happy ending there. And there's a lot to say for me about how this image compares and specifically contrasts to Freund's, the image we were just looking at prior. Whereas the previous image showed Joyce as an established artist, right, surrounded by his books in his library, doing the work of writing and literature with his manuscripts there. Here we see the artist as a young man and not yet an author, his hands perhaps idly tucked into his pockets there. Yet perhaps the most notable feature of Curran's 1904 picture is that in this image, and you've already noticed it perhaps, Joyce isn't wearing any glasses. And there's a reason for this. Joyce was first prescribed eyeglasses when he was about 6 years old. But while he was attending Belvedere College, the physician there ordered him to stop wearing them. While the exact thinking behind this order isn't clear, there's been some speculation as to why, the situation seems to imply a moralistic view of impairment, that Joyce could somehow overcome his weak vision if he only worked hard enough to strengthen his eyesight by functioning without the aids of prosthesis, which was a way of thinking about eye problems in the early 20th century. Such a prescription evokes that earlier scene, which Joyce had actually placed into portrait, though, for me too, where Stephen is labeled a lazy, idle little schemer because he's apparently unwilling to do his lessons without his glasses on and tough his way through them, right? It's quite interesting then that this portrait of the glassesless Joyce was used, and maybe your copy reflects this as well, for a number of years as the cover image for the widely distributed Penguin Classics edition of Portrait. That selection might suggest that the end goal of the novel's Bildungsroman is for Stephen to become the strapping, able-bodied young author on the book's cover, the Stephen who vigorously runs around the track, his knees well lifted in chapter 2 of Portrait, rather than the one who's knocked down and breaks his glasses in chapter 1. So kind of an ableist arc, perhaps, there gestured to with the cover image. However, as I think I've already made clear, such a reading runs counter to the fact that the novel repeatedly pursues an aesthetics occasioned by impairment over and above any normative sense of development. Other portraits, later portraits, make clear that this image of able-bodiedness is an outlier in the canon of Joyce portraits. So in many more cases, images of Joyce, especially the later ones, merge the image of the author with that of the visually impaired subject. A good example of this comes from a photograph from 1926 taken by a photographer named Berenice Abbott. So maybe you've seen this one too. This one's pretty well known. And so I'll describe this in the paragraph that comes here. Here the author appears looking off to the left, his right hand propping up his head behind his right ear. In the photograph, Joyce's hair combed straight back and graying at the temples, wears a flamboyant white jacket, striped shirt, and dotted bow tie. He also wears both eyeglasses and an eye patch over his left eye. The eye patch is a consequence of one of the surgeries Joyce began having with increased frequency during the 1920s. And it's my sense that it served less a medical purpose than a social one. Many people were shocked by the image of Joyce's eye, especially the one that had been operated on quite many times. Ezra Pound, I can't remember the exact word he used, called it monstrous maybe in a letter once. So I think to kind of smooth out social interactions, Joyce took to wearing this eye patch. The location of the shoot was also affected by Joyce's eyesight. Photosensitivity made Joyce unable to sit under the glaring lights of Abbott's studio, so Abbott had to take her equipment to Joyce's Paris apartment. Another significant difference between Kern's 1904 portrait and this 1926 one is that in the latter, Joyce is decidedly an author now. And not just any author, but the author of Ulysses, the nearly 1,000-page epic whose highly contested publication was a feat in and of itself. Joyce's posture in the photograph expresses some of this accomplishment by mixing the confidence of the earlier Joyce with the averted eyes that would become a sign of, among other things, the later Joyce's modernist disinterestedness. Abbott's photograph therefore stages an important contrast, announcing at once the author who is capable of this massive literary undertaking and the author who is regularly disabled by his vision. The terms of Roland Barthes' camera lucida can help bring this contrast into greater focus for us. In Barthes' analysis of photographic composition, the studium refers to the field of information, historical, social, cultural, that makes up a photograph's general scene. These are aspects of the image that tell the viewer they're looking at, say, a rebellion or an example of traditional Russian dress, whatever the image seems to be about. What Barthes then calls the punctum is the appearance of some sharply contrasting detail that will break the image's studium. This is typically the most arresting detail of the composition, the one that truly just absorbs us. And it's worth noting here that Barthes marshals the language of embodiment as he develops these concepts in his book. In posing, he says, quote, "I instantaneously make another body for myself." Observing a photograph prompts this question, quote, "What does my body know of photography?" And the act of taking a photograph for Barthes turns the living subject into a, quote, "lifeless corpse." Moreover, Barthes' eyes repeatedly drawn to images of impairment and disability. In the book, Bad Teeth, Blind Gypsies, and Idiot Children are just some of the examples that he describes in photographic detail, which gives additional meaning to the fact that he also labels the punctum a type of wound. It's an injury in the sense that it punctures the studium. And this focus on the corporeality of photography makes Abbott's portrait of Joyce a natural choice for such an analysis. Here, the studium is obviously the author photo, in which Joyce's fashionable clothes and even eyeglasses signify as fairly usual elements. The punctum, however, is the eye patch, which is easily the most unexpected and arresting detail in the photograph, and in this case, quite literally connected to a wound. Joyce's wounded vision punctures the typical author photo at the same time it disturbs our ideal image of the author. Reinforced for me always, and I choose this particular print of this photograph because in MoMA's collection, because of that slice in the right-hand corner at the top there, another type of wound that draws our eye. So in the sake of time, there are other portraits of Joyce I analyze in this chapter of the book, but rather than analyzing them for you in great detail here, I'll just show you a couple and say a few words about them. And if we want to circle back to them, I'll be happy to put them back on the screen. So the first comes as an oil painting about a decade after this photograph of Joyce from 26 by Jacques-Emile Blanche, 1935, a portrait of Joyce here. And in an anecdote told by Blanche about this painting, Joyce wanted to be painted at this angle because of the appearance by the 1930s of his glasses in photographs and other paintings being so thick that he thought maybe the angle, with his head off to the side there, would minimize this. That is something we can't verify, and I've seen less in Joyce's personal reflections of his own self-consciousness about his eyeglasses. So that's an interesting anecdote there. But Joyce kind of looking a little bit debonair there with his cigarette. So that's one image, and then to move on to one more that I think is the most experimental and exciting to me, at least. Here's an image from a series called Images of Joyce by Joyce's countryman, the Irish artist Louis Le Braque, who did several portraits of Joyce in this style. And the painting, as you can see, is pretty abstract, mostly black and white, just of Joyce's face, with some dabs of color, blue around the eyes, some red around the forehead, and the cheeks there. And Le Braque did other images of other authors. Maybe most notably, there's a series of Beckett. And one Joyce critic, Crystal Lerm Hayes, who writes authoritatively on Joyce and art and visual culture, says that the series resonates much more for her with Beckett's artwork and aesthetics because of its minimalism, perhaps, and its abstraction. But I actually think that this painting is such an interesting representation, not Joyce, not a portrait of Joyce, but as a portrait of his vision. If Joyce was indeed farsighted, it's only the aspects of the painting that are closest to us that come into any detail, everything else fading into the background there. The eyes themselves, the blue seems to suggest the pressure and fogginess of glaucoma to me, and it's the left eye, which is almost blotted out entirely here, which was Joyce's worst eye. And so all of those seem to connect with me quite clearly to Joyce's own low vision and the way that he was representing it in his work. So finally, the accumulation of signature visual characteristics in all of these portraits anticipates the way some very recent images of Joyce can function as merely stripped down silhouettes. And maybe you've seen some of these too. I'll just talk about them a little bit. At this point, it's probably not surprising that the most salient feature of these silhouettes, the one that cannot be taken away without the image failing to convey the author it is meant to represent, tends to be Joyce's glasses. If you do see kind of iconography of Joyce or images of Joyce, his glasses usually jump to the foreground there. I'm thinking here of simple line drawings that compose an image of Joyce in just a few angled lines for hair, perhaps a scribble for a goatee, and the round circles for the frames of his glasses. That's really all you need to do to conjure the image of Joyce. Indeed, in the right context, all one needs to conjure Joyce is the outline of these frames. This is the case in highly abstract portraits of the author completed by contemporary artists like Valerio Adami and Robert Motherwell, where the circular frames of Joyce's glasses are the only concrete detail that makes the image at all recognizable as a portrait. Interestingly, a similar effect is at play with t-shirts or other commercial products that may just use the bold outline of Joyce's glasses next to, say, a quote from one of his books. I have even seen, while walking down the street in Dublin, a sign for an optometry shop, on which there was only a pair of round eyeglass frames, and because it was Dublin, the signification of these frames was quite clear to me, Joyce. Or recently, down the street in Kramer's bookstore right here in DC, they've got some very interesting wallpaper that I snapped a photo of there. Literary themed, of course, because it's a bookstore with a constellation of authors and other book-related images. Oscar Wilde up there, the famous Napoleon's Army photo of Wilde in the upper left-hand corner. Virginia Woolf is floating around somewhere.
Bottom right.
Bottom right,
Right,
thank you.
yeah.
A little bit dark in this particular photograph. And it's Darwin in the middle. Look at Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
And right next to Darwin, a pair of eyeglass frames. Which for me, because of the other coordinates of this image, right, if Wolf's there, Joyce has to be there too. But the eyeglasses stand in here as well for Joyce. So in the end, the bearish trace of Joyce is the outline of his impaired vision. Eyeglasses become a symbol of Joyce, and because Joyce is a symbol of modernism, they also become a symbol of the importance of that eyesight to modern art and literature more generally. Thanks very much.
That was incredibly elegant and satisfying, sort of the structure of the talk. We have time, thanks for sticking to time. We have time for questions. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm not going to jump in.
Oh, sure.
John's gonna kick us off to start.
Thank you. I don't know what to make out of this exactly, but as you were talking about Monet and his paintings and the effect of his visual impairment, I thought really for a painter, there's two aspects of that, right? One is their ability to look at the subject that they're painting.
Yeah.
And the other is their ability to look at the canvas and the paints that they're painting with, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly what to make out of that, but I wonder if that's a distinction that has any relevance at all to anything you were talking about. And then I have one other thing.
No, that's great, and it might be the reason why Monet perhaps limited himself to subject matter he was more familiar with in his later years. So the Japanese bridge was right outside of his home, and he had painted it so many times. And so perhaps that comfort with that scenery is what led him there. And the other thing I'm thinking about, and your comments are really useful for highlighting, is that it did absolutely change his artistic practice. The late Monet paintings are huge. If you've ever seen a late version of Lily Pads, they're an entire room.
Yeah.
And they're breathtaking for their scale. And again, for me, that's occasioned by his visual impairment. We would not have those breathtaking paintings were Monet not experiencing that in his later years. And so that kind of connection for me is absolutely crucial, and the way in which it intervenes in practice. Now, Joyce, you can make a similar point for, again, using a magnifying glass to write in the 1920s, it helped him write. And so perhaps, and again, I would never want to put too much pressure on this, but the attention to fine detail in Ulysses is a product, perhaps, of the practice that Joyce developed, that magnifying glass that he brought in, again, because of his low vision.
By the way, I can't even imagine what eye surgery must have been like back in the 1900 years ago.
I mean, free cocaine though.
The second thing I wanted to bring up is I just wonder if in your literary considerations here, you paid any attention or have any interest in Borges.
I have been told that I need to think about him more, and so I have not yet. But were you thinking anything in particular, or just pointing me in that direction?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me is the short story, and it's on the subject of the double. I'm not sure if that's the title of the short story, but you know, he's wandering around. I forget where he's from, Portugal or some Latin American country. At some point late in life, and he sits down on a park bench, and another guy sits down next to him, and they get into an argument about which one is the real him. And there was some mention in there of blindness and some. I'm sorry, it's very dim in my recollection.
No, this is great. Every time I talk about this subject, people point me to things I haven't been thinking of, and that's one.
There was something about, you know, well, I remember this because I went blind in this time, and you know, the other half of the double retorts in some way. The details of it usually lost on me at this point.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. Yeah, Nicole?
Thank you so much for this talk. It was so fascinating and really generative for me, because as you know, I work in your period somewhat, though not on Joyce much at all. And while you were talking, it really occurred to me how different writers and artists, kind of like what their disposition is towards the issues of Impressionism itself. So I was thinking while you were speaking of Conrad, right? And Ian Watt's famous essay on Impressionism and symbolism in Heart of Darkness. And one of the things that I was trying to think through as you were talking about this is that so much of that text is indebted on the one hand to the techniques of Impressionism. And on the other hand, as Watt points out, Conrad himself really dismissed Impressionism because he saw it as like not finished, right? The idea of a sketch. And And I guess we could think about like different modernist authors as themselves sort of enacting a different kind of ethos towards the idea of blurred vision or glared vision, right? So the dramatization of Heart of Darkness is so much about like getting the glass in the right place, right? To sort of like sharpen the image. So I'm just wondering if you think about the modernist period itself as sort of a dialectic or even a dialogue between those who embrace or tolerate or encourage
Right.
the generative motion of that kind of aesthetic and those who.
Yeah,
And
thank you so much. Yeah, I'm gonna say a bunch here and then I'm gonna want to talk to you more about this afterwards. The original essay that then has ballooned into a book project is about both Conrad and Joyce, kind of side by side. And Conrad apparently gave up sailing because of his vision, and maybe turned to literature to fill that hole or something like that. And in the Conrad part of that essay, which is going to become another chapter in the book, I trace the way Impressionism itself early on was received as a disability through degeneration theory and early degeneration scientists who were seeing modern art and were thinking that the people making modern art must be disabled, right? They must be impaired by the modern world, overloaded in their sensation. And that seems to me to be what Conrad specifically is always grappling with, right? To receive all these sensations, but then to triumph maybe in their description over them and not to be completely overwhelmed. So I think he was thinking about it in terms of degeneration and degeneration theory a lot. But across modernism as a whole, you know, there are all these are a bit older genealogies of modernism, hard and soft modernism. There's definitely a clear and blurry modernism, right? And so there is at least half of modernism that's not in the legacy that I'm describing here, that's really indebted to erasing blur and instilling clarity, imagism, right? Like you've got to see it. And so part of my project is about kind of redescribing that as a pretty ableist aesthetic that is at least half of modernism, and another part of modernism that's much more comfortable with embodiment and impairment and the result of those things. Yeah.
We can think about brutalism as a sort of form of clarity, sort of express clarity.
Absolutely.
As in this building that we're in right now.
That's right.
Bob was very interested in the building as we arrived up. It was like it's very unhappy inside, but looks cool outside. More questions. I have a bunch of questions. It's my shtick in some way, not the thing, but yeah.
I was just wondering, have you been to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia?
I have, yes.
Okay.
I'll share it more.
Because I remember a long time ago when I was there, and they said that they had the manuscript of Ulysses. They had the original one, and it's written in his handwriting. But I remember them saying he used blue crayon for some reason. Do you know anything?
His
about that?
revisions.
He made corrections with a blue crayon. Yeah.
There are actually manuscripts with many different colors that meant different things.
Yeah.
Okay.
And reading Joyce's handwriting sent people, as you can imagine, to fits because they couldn't read what he was saying, and they covered over with colors on top of that. And so the printing of Ulysses was a notoriously difficult process involving, you know, a dozen Dutch printers or some typesetters trying to figure out what he was saying and circling back to him. And of course, he was revising up to the last minute. But yeah, and his handwriting gets, like Monet, there's a scale difference. Later in his career, his handwriting gets very large. And there are recordings of Joyce from I think the 30s when he was working on Finnegan's Wake, audio recordings. And to be able to do the recordings, he had to write the text on big flashcards so that he could read it. And you could hear the flashcards being turned in the background because only a few words could fit on each. There's also a very famous anecdote, you know, which is just kind of fun, and it might also be apocryphal, about the writing of Finnegan's Wake, by which time Joyce was almost blind. And Samuel Beckett was one of Joyce's secretaries helping him write down the book. And while Beckett's there writing, someone knocks on the door and Joyce says, "Come in," and Beckett records that into the book as well. It's still there. And so, but then again, that's about the practice of the book being written, being changed by visual impairment. And the way in which the book can make space for that is very interesting. People say maybe that's not true. It's too good of a story, perhaps.
Can I ask you, you mentioned the letters very briefly. The letters are not it's not especially expansive
Right.
on his eyesight or even his surgery or anything else. And there's a way that, you know, if we want to do, which is what you're not doing, is a biographical reading of Joyce's impairment. We're lacking some detail that we might expect because he was also a prolific letter writer. But in fact, like what we would expect is for him to talk about the thing that was among the most sort of pressing everyday issues for him. But weirdly, they're not very expressive on that front.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that's right.
To your point, John, in a way.
Yeah, and Birmingham would say that's because he was embarrassed about the syphilis, maybe, right? There's like one letter where he like suggests that he, you know,
A burning sensation.
Right, yeah, and so all of that is perhaps to avoid the subjects around what might have been ailing him. There are some, and you get the sense that other people could not totally sympathize or understand always what he was going through, and that thus perhaps it's less of a thing you would correspond about. Because in poetry collection at Buffalo, he actually drew a diagram for Sylvia Beach, who published Ulysses, about his eye surgery and how, you know, he's getting iridectomies, which is taking part of your iris out. And so he draws what an iridectomy would be. And again, you have to assume that most people couldn't relate to the extremity of Joyce's particular condition, 14 eye surgeries, daily struggles with writing, and in his attempt to kind of write still amidst all that. Yeah, that's interesting though.
Can I go back to one of the quotes from Word of the Artist, the one that ends with the one about him trying to read, slash write, or not doing his lesson.
That's right.
And I'm going to do something like incredibly old-fashioned in a way, but I was struck by, and in part this was given to me by your comment later about the tension between reading the sort of failed Bildungsroman of A Portrait of the Artist as a kind of in the Gregory Castle and Jane Esty way, as a kind of an expression of a sort of failed modernist development or development of capitalist modernity. And then thinking, you know, your own response to say, actually, what we need to think through here is that there's also a sort of an aesthetic of low vision at work here. And I know this is terrible, but I'm going to just focus on that last word, because if you think about in Dubliners after the race, and in several places throughout Ulysses, Joyce plays exactly on that word capital to make that mixture between capital as money, capital as, you know, world capital, capital as national capital, and all of those things. I don't know if that's necessarily there in A Portrait of the Artist, but all of those things sort of seem to overlap on top of each other. And I was wondering if this is also good, in part because we were reading Frederick Jameson today, and like this idea of like we only see the fine invisible threads, or in fact the full curves of the capital through this kind of like semi-impossible vision in some way. And I'm you know, it's doing a little bit too much with the work, but with the word, but it made me think of that idea of the sort of the low vision being also a perspicacious vision of a particular version of it, you know, to go through your word, not, you didn't say I assume a reification, but
but it's something like a condition of being a modern subject, where
in some sense,
you never quite see everything all together because it's also entangled and impossible to envision. I think that's definitely true. I've also been trying to think through maybe the connections between something like low vision and something I didn't talk a lot about today, national identity. I've been thinking about how in Ulysses, the Cyclops is the most full-throated kind of voice of national identity, and it's a normative one. It's one about strength, right? Nationalism and strength and health, you might say. Those are words that belong to nationalism, and how maybe something of low vision can be involved in a critique of that normative body, which is at the heart of the national body as well.
I have a question about this. The first part of that sentence, he talks about letters plural. Then he switches to a single word, a single letter, excuse me. Single letter. So
He's reading the line, zeal without prudence is like a ship adrift. Sorry, I shouldn't have answered that for you, Bob.
From the book.
Yeah, from the book. And I imagine the capital is the Z, or what you people in this country might call a Z.
Yeah.
But it also speaks to, it's that magnification process, isn't it? The disruption of the whole for the sake of the detail that happens again because of his low vision in this moment. That it's I mean, when do you look at the shape of letters, right? It's something you blow past usually in your experience of reading, but he is the reading has been disrupted here. So he's taking in the letters themselves and the way they look in this way that he's confronted by it. They are immediate rather than immediate for him. Yeah.
He doesn't write in this. So imagine what he's learning is cursive.
Right.
And so there's particular attention to the full curves of the capital.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So because this is such an interesting project, it's impossible for me now to stop thinking of different
Create
moments and media. So,
taking your
okay,
notes and I'll steal later.
and given what you were just saying too before about like, you know, these different kinds of branches of modernism. So I was thinking, because you said that you're also, and I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about this if you wanted to, about Tuna Barnes, because I started thinking about the surrealists and like, okay, and all these examples, right, on Shannon Andalou, which begins with the slitting of the eye, right? So it's like the surrealists, the psychoanalytic internal vision can see once the empirical vision is, let go of. So I was just wondering, like, is there something about the kind of surrealist or whatever, the kind of turn inward that comes at the sacrifice of the actual eye itself?
Oh, totally.
That plays into, the
And this
argument.
syncs up a lot with Joyce and Finnegan's Wake, right, which
Yeah.
is also a turn inward. And one of the reasons why I don't deal with Finnegan's Wake a lot in the book project, people have written very well on Joyce's blindness and how it produced that book.
Yeah.
And it's a dream book, right? So that turn inward, totally launched from his lack of vision there. And so I back up, and I'm more interested in the space where something is still trying to be represented, but representation itself changes, because of the impairment or the resistance, the friction of what's happening there. But the Tuna Barnes, if folks have read Nightwood, I've got an essay coming out on Nightwood in Modernism and Modernity about just how impossible it is to see anything going on in that book. And Barnes was not visually impaired, and that's kind of one of the points I'm making here too, right? We don't have to just talk about disability aesthetics with authors who had impairments, right? We should be a little bit more generous and generative about how we talk about these things. So Barnes had no discernible issues with her eyesight, but her book is very clearly to me an impairment of what we call narrative perspective or point of view. And one of the things I'm most interested in is why do we assume narrative perspective and point of view, which are very embodied terms, right? They presume a person. Why do we presume always that narrators have the same sensory perceptions that we do? And they're almost always normative, right? Or in the case of the modernist novel, kind of like superpowers, like a narrator can see into people's minds and hear what their thoughts are, right? So we grant narrators all the time a lot of sensory perception abilities. And I think Tuna Barnes is interested in like scaling those back and showing what restrictions can do. Yeah. That's probably backlogged. 2 years from now, you'll
We'll
be.
get to the last question, then we'll give Bob a
No,
break.
just
We
comment.
can also continue the conversation afterwards. yeah.
While you were speaking, everything turned into a blur. How did you?
Oh, yeah. Well,
How'd you do that?
best $20 I ever spent.
On that note, well, first of all, let's thank Bob and elegantly structured talk. Yeah, I really appreciate that. A couple of adverts. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks. So there are a lot of people who've emailed me over the last couple of weeks who can't be here, who want to watch the recording. So thanks for those who are going to watch this later. Appreciate it. A lot of people this time, and I'm not sure why, Bob, but very, very popular among people who can't be here today. How long are you in town tomorrow? What time's your train?
Noon.
So I haven't been to it yet, but has anyone been to the new Impressionism exhibition, 1874, Salon de Fusée, at the National Gallery in Edinburgh?
Okay.
really good.
It sounds like it was the
Amazing.
blockbuster
Yeah, no,
exhibition of the decade, in a sense, yeah. And Wednesday morning would be a great time to go.
Oh, yeah.
Number two, if you ever get an invitation to the residence of the Irish ambassador, you'll see some of those Louis Le Brocquet portraits, which are really, really beautiful in person. These incredible sort of deep, they have a depth to them that you simply can't see in that picture. Last advert. At 7 o'clock, if you're still on campus and if you're bored and if you need something to do, at 7 o'clock in Copley Formal Lounge, the Sri Lankan writer Shehan Karnatalaka, who won the Booker Prize 2 years ago for 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, which is one of the best books of the last 20 years, we'll be doing a reading from 7 to 8 in Copley Formal Lounge. So if you're bored or if the weather keeps you here, the traffic, I'm looking at the traffic on the bridge is terrible. You should go to that. I think it'll be a great, the book itself is explosively brilliant. So those are all my adverts. Thanks again, Bob. I assume you'll hang around for some questions for a short while. Please eat some food here because Cynthia's going to have to, for those of you who come regularly to Global Irish Studies, I just want to introduce you to two guys. I think you'll know Dara Gannon, who's the associate director, but has been hanging around here for a while and has officially arrived as of last month. So thank you, Dara. You should take classes with Dara in the history department. And Cynthia Chen is one of our 2 program assistants. So thanks, Cynthia, for helping us organize this. And thanks to Chris Doyle in the English department, who always goes above and beyond. It is no longer his job, and yet he does it. So thanks, everybody. And please mingle, talk to Bob, ask him more questions. And yeah, really, that was really fantastic.